My name is Brett, and the story that I am about to relate is bizarre to say the least. But if you bear with me, I think by telling it I can make some kind of sense out of it, at least to myself. As you probably already know, I'm a narrator and I read scary stories on YouTube. These stories have been drawn from various sources, some submitted by my subscribers, some I'd found online, and others, especially more recently, were written by writers that I hired who were on my team. It's one of these writers that's kind of the catalyst for this story because, you see, he's put me into a story quite without my permission, I might add, and quite by surprise as well. I made the mistake of telling him that for his next story, anything goes. And well, here we are. Now, I have to admit I'm a little nervous about what comes next, but as long as you're with me, dear listener, I think I could find the nerve to keep going. This tale began upon my first acceptance of a story from the writer in question. I put out an ad for the job, and he responded with a pretty decent submission about a hiker being chased by something in the woods. It went well, so I had him write another and then another, and pretty soon he became one of my regular writers, and I often found myself looking forward to his submissions. All in all, it was a good match, at least on the surface, but from the day that I read his first story, I began to feel like there was something off. It was as though there was an energy in my life that hadn't been there before, a presence, and it lingered on the edge of my attention. No matter what I did, I couldn't shake it, and I barely noticed it most of the time. But when I did notice it, or rather when I remembered it, it was like someone had been standing in the room with me, staring at me. At first, it was just a feeling, you know, just the sense that I wasn't entirely alone, even and especially when I thought that I was. Then as time wore on and the stories kept coming, I started to notice odd things, like how everything seemed just a shade darker than it had been, or how the shadows that lingered at the edges of my vision had begun to swirl and dance wildly. It was like the darkness could hear music that I was deaf to and couldn't help but revel in it. Speaking of music, I started hearing odd noises that didn't make any sense. Not that sounds were out of place or that they didn't belong, but just really strange noises that I couldn't associate with any known phenomenon. I was sitting in my car and I heard a noise from the back seat that sounded like a cross between a whisper and a pack of wild animals grunting. It was unlike anything I'd heard before, and it scared the living out of me. I did also hear bangs and whispers from time to time as well, but compared to the other sounds, they seemed almost pedestrian. I started seeing them a lot more often. The shadows, I mean, whereas before, I'd occasionally see some movement out of the corner of my eye and turned to find nothing. Now, when I turned, I saw a shape move across the hall, around a corner, or behind a door. I would chase them down, thinking it was an animal that got in, or an intruder, only to find absolutely nothing. Unlike times before when I'd caught movement like that, I could no longer dismiss these sightings as a trick of the light, the eye, or the mind. Or if I did, I'd have to accept that I was losing mine. The phenomenon only became more intense as time wore on as well, to the point where it was starting to affect my life in general and my work in particular. One incident that really bothered me happened while I was recording a video for this channel. It was one of these writer stories now that I think about it. I kept getting distracted by this roughly cat-sized shadow that constantly crept in my peripheral vision, sort of peeking at what I was doing. It would startle me, which is to say that it would scare the hell out of me, and I'd have to start that section all over again. And by the third time, I had had enough and kind of freaked out. I wound up leaving for a few hours just to let whatever it was find something else to interest it, which didn't actually help. When I first started noticing these shadow figures, it was limited to my home and studio, and I would usually only see them at night. But as time passed, I started seeing them everywhere. When I go get coffee or to buy groceries, or even just when I went for a walk outside, they would dance and whirl and jump, but when I turned to watch them, they were gone. I would always just catch glimpses of shapes of things that might be, but never actually saw what they were. It got to the point where they'd become almost commonplace in my life, which was frankly terrifying. I watched one scurry under my car the other day and stood there for longer than I'd like to admit, afraid to get inside my own vehicle. I'd also see them in uncomfortable areas, and while seeing a shadow moving around your bedroom at night was unnerving to say the least, watching a human-shaped shade crawl under a stall door as you walk into a public restroom is a whole other level of fear. What is worse than being aware of these shadows and seeing them more and more often is that I am almost certain that they are more and more aware of me as well. Moreover, I am starting to realize that they are aware of the fact that I can see them. I realized that they were getting bold and seemed to stop caring whether or not I saw them, but became far more interested in me. They de-linger at the corners of my eyes and almost wait for me to completely turn and to look at them before absconding. Where I really started to notice something was very wrong, though, and where I genuinely started to get worried was the day that I saw them moving around other people. Thankfully, I never saw the shadows moving around anyone in my own life, but I did see them follow people from time to time. The people in question were always oblivious and often seemed agitated or troubled in some way. It made me question my own moods and the reasons for them. Were they why I was suddenly angry, or were they drawn to anger? I still don't know really, but I've lost sleep over it. It wasn't just bad moods. I soon realized, once when I had stopped to get gas at night, I saw what I can only describe as a pack of them sort of carrying on. Near this flashy red sports car, they were dancing as they usually did, but in a rather agitated and distracting way. They disappeared when I looked their way, of course, but when I look away again, they'd start leaping out from their hiding places and jumping wildly. As I stood in futility, searching for them through squinting eyes, the owner of the car came out of the gas station. The man looked really angry and like he was probably under the influence of something as he stormed across the parking lot to his vehicle. When he got inside, he slammed the door and peeled out wildly, and as I winced, I thought I saw the little shadows chasing after his car. I had initially thought that maybe they were just drawn to the color or maybe just the loud noise. But later on that week, I heard about a wreck involving a car of the exact same make and model as the one in question. Whether these shadows caused the crash or they were simply aware that it was going to occur and were animated about it, I'm still unsure. I'm not even sure that there's a connection between what I saw and the car that crashed, but it all just fits far too well. I had to stop worrying about that though, as the shadows, while frightening, became the least of my worries. This presence, this darkness, this utter change within the fabric of what I had understood to be reality only grew more pronounced and unnerving as time wore on. Everything that I saw began to shift into a shadowy version of the world I had once lived in. People, places, and even objects were different. They became darker and more sinister reflections of what they'd been before. Some people started to change, or maybe I could just see the shadows in them that had always been there. It was as though every third person or so was somehow corrupted in some way. Some looked insane, others looked cruel or suspicious, while others seemed downright malevolent, like they just as soon stabbed me to death as look at me. And it wasn't just the strangers either, you see. Friends that I'd known for decades whose faces I knew well seemed like strangers to me now, their visages twisted into horrible caricatures of who I'd once known them to be. It made even the simplest gatherings almost impossible. I ran into a friend I'd not seen in months one day, and I had to awkwardly catch up with him, all the while trying to pretend that his face wasn't shrouded in darkness, and that he wasn't glaring at me the whole time. It felt very important that I keep how I was seeing these people to myself, but for the life of me, I couldn't tell you why. My home started to shift as well. The hallway from my bedroom to the living room suddenly had these bizarre off-kilter angles that I simply couldn't account for, which made no sense. The way they looked now was so crooked it looked like it should affect the structural stability of the building. Yet, nothing collapsed. The water in my faucet started to carry a thick, oily quality that I couldn't get rid of, even when I boiled it. Sometimes it even came out with streaks of black in it that oddly smelled like petrichor. In the ash from a campfire, the trees outside now harbored an inky shifting mass of shadow which seemed almost organic. It emanated or secreted from the bark of the trucks and branches and pulsed at odd intervals. It was like the opposite of light. It didn't shine. It lingered. Things also started to look worn or like they'd aged many years in a short time. A brand new stop sign, which I'd actually seen being put up, was now covered in rust and had what looked like 3 claw marks across it. Though from what I could not tell you, dear listener, and all that is bad enough, but what I couldn't shake was the feeling that this was somehow what the world actually was. This darkness was not something I was experiencing for the first time, but something that I was remembering from a time, from a life that I had forgotten. It all seemed somehow unnervingly familiar, and that familiarity instilled a fear in me greater than anything else. I was so disturbed by it all that I eventually decided to confront the writer, Kevin. After I made the connection that I began working with him, I thought I was going to sound insane, or that he would think of it as a joke. So, you can imagine by my surprise when his response was an apology. He told me that he tried to not respond to my ad, that he tried so hard not to hit the button to send his first story, but he couldn't. He said that it was like no matter how hard he tried to not submit work or even write it, that he was compelled to. I didn't quite understand, at least at first, and I asked Kevin to elaborate. He went on to tell me that he had seen and heard everything that I had described and more, that he'd been struggling with all of it for years now, and that he realized that he was spreading it with his writing, but that he didn't understand how or why. He told me that before he met me, he was trying to quit writing altogether, but couldn't force himself to do so. He then apologized again and admitted his only explanation for any of it was a bit outside the box. I was creeped over by Kevin's response. I had at best expected him to tell me something about how his work was known, to sort of stay with people, or that he used a writing technique that got into people's heads. I certainly didn't expect him to have any similar experiences to my own or any kind of explanation for what was happening. Initially, I was furious because if he had already known how to spread it or even suspected, then he was responsible for what was happening to me. However, I found myself more curious than angry, and since I had absolutely no explanations for what was occurring, I pressed him for one. Kevin told me that he called the creatures and fish people that we had both been seeing the Dark Fey. He told me that he believed that they came from a dimension of shadows and that they had been here longer than humans had existed. He said that they are and were always here, but that most people just didn't see them, that humanity had long ago learned to forget that they exist, because living in reality alongside them drives most people crazy. In the exact moment that I read that message from Kevin, I remembered that I'd seen them constantly as a child, that I used to watch them hide inside my bedroom closet and creep up to my bed in the middle of the night. I remembered seeing a dozen or more of them surrounding my bed and dancing in a circle. When I'd wake up from a nightmare, they'd always disappear. So I thought they were just part of the nightmare, but now I knew I was wrong because I remembered that they were real. Then Kevin asked me something strange. He mentioned music like a slightly out-of-tune marching band and said that it always sounded like it was simultaneously coming from far away and just in the next room, or around the next corner. He said he heard it on and off for the last 3 years and asked me if I had heard it myself. When I told him that I hadn't, he seemed almost relieved. Kevin then apologized again and told me to try to ignore all of it, that if I could manage to just ignore them completely, I might be able to forget them again. He then abruptly ended our conversation and logged off. I stopped hearing from him after that. I tried to message him a few times because I wanted to ask him more about what was happening to the both of us, but he cut off all communications. So then I was back to square one, but somehow even more out of my mind about it all. The Dark Fey, Shadow Dimensions. Seriously, I started to feel like maybe both Kevin and I had spent a little too much time creating horror content and it was getting to us both. But at the same time, I was seeing what I was seeing, and he confirmed that he'd seen it as well. He'd even described the way they danced to me, which was spot on. I decided to simply take Kevin's advice and do my best to ignore these things when I saw them. And for a while, it actually worked a little. I trained myself to not react when I caught something out of the corner of my eye. I forced myself just to get into my car, even after I'd seen what was crawling around inside of it. I did my best to forget, and again, it worked just a little. For 2 weeks straight, I just tried to sideline all of it and focus heavily on work. Gradually, I stopped noticing the little things, like the little shadows or the decay, and did my best to ignore the big things like the trees and the up-looking people. My personal life improved and my work life stopped being so stressful. I got some stories up on the channel and they did well. It started to seem like something that I could live with, or at least around, and not have it completely consume my life. On the 4th of October, 2025, I was running an errand in the middle of the day, and when I came back to my car, I almost screamed. There, standing just next to my vehicle, was what I can only describe as a giant chest piece, like a pawn. It was jet black and like 20 feet tall. After being initially jolted by its presence, I thought for a second that it was like a decoration, like one of those huge inflatables that car dealerships use to bring people in. But it didn't move, not so much as an inch in the autumn breeze. I found myself unable to ignore it or even look away from it for a long while. It was like it was staring at me, and it somehow felt angry. I quickly noticed that no one else could see it and knew that whatever it was one of them. It made no sound and continued to remain rigidly still as it just loomed there like a massive dark monolith. After 5 solid minutes of just standing in the parking lot staring back at this thing, I noticed a couple of people were looking at me. One of them kept looking up at the sky trying to see what I was looking at, and I decided that it was getting awkward and nothing seemed to happen. So, I just got into my car and turned it on to leave. As I was leaving the parking lot, I spotted a woman standing on the sidewalk staring at me. Her eyes were swollen and she had bags under them. She wasn't one of those Dark Fey. She looked normal, just tired, sort of sad. Her gaze followed me as I pulled up to the parking lot exit, and her eyes met. She never said a word and neither did I, but I knew that she had seen whatever that was, that she saw all of it, just like Kevin did, just like I did. And we looked at each other for a few more moments, and then she just walked off without saying or doing anything else. I tried to speak to her to ask her if I was right about her, but I was afraid that I might be wrong or worse, that I was absolutely horribly correct. It wasn't like either of us could do much for one another. All talking about it would do is make it worse. The only thing that anyone who saw what I'd seen could do was try to forget about it, and that's what I resolved to do immediately. Or so I tried to. As I turned my attention forward and ready to turn out of the parking lot, I shouted an alarm as the giant black visage of that goddamn monolith just appeared right in the middle of the road. And no, it just didn't appear. It was just there. It had been behind me back where I parked my car. Then I looked away from the road for only a second and it was just there. Again, I sat there staring at it until someone behind me beat their horn, which made me jump and start again. I didn't know what else to do, so I just turned out of the lot. Coming way too close to the chest piece looking thing, I drove past it and kept driving, resolved to just head home. When I hit the first traffic light, however, I jerked and almost ran the red light when I saw it on the opposite right-hand corner. Again, just suddenly there. It was at this exact moment that I heard the music. It seemed to be coming from the other side of the department store I'd just been in. Or maybe it was from the car behind me. Couldn't really tell. It was like someone was playing a hiri-jerty, a theremin, and an old organ at the same time. When I heard it and realized what it was, I started to cry because I also realized that what I was seeing in her eyes of that woman wasn't just sadness. It was pity. I think that I understand now. I think that reading this to you all has helped me to make that sense. Finally, I do understand now. And oh, no, you see, I've never been in control. This was all so utterly inevitable. It's October 5th now, and I received another story from Kevin. This story, actually, I tried not to accept his submission. I even tried harder not to read it, and I'm doing my level best. As you can hear these words, dear listener, not to speak them, but I'm unable to. My actions, it seems, are no longer my own, even if my thoughts are. That's kind of funny. How did Kevin know I would want to say that? He must have remembered it just as he must have remembered that I was all that I am past saving, which is why he sent another story. Then again, he's no more in control than me than you. Dear sweet listener, I truly am so very sorry for what I have done to you. But being that you've come this far with me, what's a little further into the dark? Do you see them dancing? Can you hear the music?